right, so the client checklist or the client intake checklist, if you yourself are a coach. So this is what we should be looking for in an athlete. This is what an athlete needs to bring to the table. So a minimum of 3 years of training, actually a minimum of 3 consecutive years of training. So, nothing like, hey, first year of college, we were training most of that year, but then didn't really do a whole lot until, we hit the real world and we're like, man, freshman 15 and beyond, right? Let's get back into shape. No, we want 3 years of solid training. And one thing to keep in mind is that not all 3 years of training are created equal, right? So again, when I speak of 3 years of good solid training, that means and things don't have to be perfect, but a lot of the fundamentals were put in place. And of course, a biggest reason I think for this is going to be that after 3 years of good solid training, we are going to have a good muscular base in place. So usually that's about how long it takes for us to really, really look like we lift, but also acquire other attributes and skills that will be highly useful to us once we do contest prep. So 3 years of some solid training, consecutive years. 3 consecutive years. All right. So that's the first one. The next, it's part of a timeline as well here. The actual contest prep timeline. This goes both ways, both for the athlete and the coach, in that we're going to need at least 20 weeks. Yeah, there used to be a time where 20 weeks was kind of seen as extreme and a little edgy. But one thing that even those people who were still kind of surprised by the 20 weeks, one thing they did agree upon is that, it's going to make it more likely that you are going to get in shape. 20 weeks, pretty good. But I would also, to build upon this, advise probably anywhere between 24 to 30 weeks as being the ideal time frame. And look, if we get there early, that is not as much of a problem as, not making it at all, because we did the classic 12-week contest prep. So we need a realistic timeline. And realistically, for most people, that's going to be a minimum of 20 weeks, but 24 to 30 weeks is better. So for both of you, the athlete, if your coach is suggesting something that is below that, minor red flag, I would definitely negotiate if we can perhaps at least do 20, but even better would be 24 to 30. And same thing with you contest prep coaches or future contest prep coaches. I would suggest that if an athlete is and this is the show they want to do, that if it's too close and it's not giving you enough time, that you really haggle and perhaps scan the calendar and see if there's something that we can aim for that is a little bit later. Ideally, again, 20 weeks as the minimum, 24 to 30 weeks being what I would consider more ideal here. So now I guess what we're going to get into is one that is very important. And when we look at the 3 years that we ideally have spent living the gym rat life, we want plenty of that time to be in a fed state. I'd say 4 times the amount that we have spent in a state of fat loss, in a hypocaloric state. And of course, this is important because this is going to aid us in the quest to having enough muscle, right? It's also going to show us that, hey, there is a rhyme and a reason when it comes to gaining weight on purpose, right? That it's a worthwhile investment, and we must normalize that, because I think fat loss It's always kind of been this way. It's always been kind of synonymous with fitness, right? With bodybuilding. But this portion of your adventures in physique athlete land are just as important. So yes, we want, I'd say, at least 3/4 of our 3 years, at the very least 3/4 of our 3 years spent in a state where we were at the very least eating enough, all right, and that we're okay with weight gain, and that we understand that it has a purpose, and that there's many seasons to our bodies, right? So plenty of time in a fed state, and again, the main reason for this is because beyond a certain point, it's going to be increasingly difficult to gain muscle in a hypocaloric state, being underfed, right? We will not be able to do that in a deficit once we've been training long enough. So this one, very important. And then also, right before we start the prep, we probably don't want to connect it to a previous fat loss phase. So you don't want to come down that fat loss hill and then, well, actually more like up that fat loss hill, because that's more what it feels like, and then have to start a prep shortly thereafter. So ideally we want to start our prep coming off a gaining phase, or even a maintenance phase, which is how I like to do it, and we will get into that when it comes to contest prep positioning a little bit later. But again, we don't want to connect a fat loss phase to a contest prep. That one, very, very important. All right, especially right before the contest prep, we don't want to be coming off one fat loss phase and then connect it to the the most extreme version of a fat loss phase. Next is going to be the whys. We need to get into the whys. Why do we want to do this? I think the more intrinsic the reasoning there is, the athlete has, that you might have as to why you want to start a contest prep, the better off we're going to be. The more you're going to enjoy the process, which is important because the majority of our time spent contest prepping is, a very small fraction of it is going to be spent on that stage, right? A good chunk of it is going to be spent in the middle of the process, right? Which there's a lot to. That you're gonna have this huge checklist of things that you have to do that you can't necessarily take a full day off from. There's going to be many moments where you don't necessarily feel your greatest, but you're able to understand and connect this to your ultimate goal here, right? Which is achieving, I guess, your version of the ultimate physique, or your current ultimate physique, right? Because we're going to improve over time. But if your whys aren't strong whys, it's going to be very, very hard to push through when it becomes more difficult. So, things like I want to transform my body, right? We should be beyond that, right? Because at this point we should already have a pretty solid physique to begin with, right? Or I just got over a breakup, and this is how I'm going to, I guess, make myself happy and show him or show her. These are the kind of things you want to look out for when it comes to your own reasoning and the reasoning of your athletes. And you want to hear more things along the line of like, for example, I just want to test myself, and I want to push myself because, I've done a pretty good job up until this point. I've done a few things, and I want this contest prep to kind of sort of be the carrot that I can chase. So we want more things like that. The more intrinsic our reasons are, the more likely we are to stick around when things get difficult. All right. Next is we want some fat loss experience. So we talked about spending enough time in a gaining phase, right? A state where at the very least we're eating enough. Fat loss experience, super important. This is where me personally, I made a mistake in that I hadn't had a whole lot of fat loss experience. I had gotten myself into decent shape a few times, but it was totally different when we were pushing like to decent shape and beyond, and then also with a deadline looming, right? I could have used a little bit more fat loss experience. And why do we need this? Well, it's a chance to, experiment with a lot of things that will be relevant to you once you do contest prep. Things like more or less where your calories need to be, at this point, at that point. What's the best combination, at least in the earlier stages of fat loss, the best combination of cardio and nutritional intervention when it comes to a deficit. Some practice with maybe refeed structure, some practice with diet breaks and seeing how those work and when is the best time to place them. And then, inside of just, I guess, that stat sheet, some experience when it comes to the fat loss coping skills. I think this one is a huge one, because when you hear people talk about contest prep, that is probably what you hear the most of is how difficult it is and how hard it was at times to make it happen. While a sound plan can take you quite far, there's also a lot of things that you pick up on as you are going through your fat loss phase. Things such as meal structure, right? Perhaps how to make certain life events fit into the structure of a contest prep. How to just cope with the most obvious, the suck, right? Because it doesn't entirely go away, and as a matter of fact, it actually gets worse as we go. Of course, the goal, back to good old Mel Sif. Our goal is to minimize that, but nevertheless, you're going to have to progressively overload in regards to your fat loss coping. And a good place to start is going to be with just your general fat loss phases in the off season, and not necessarily leaning down to contest prep shape, but at least going far enough where there are things that we can take from these phases and apply to our contest prep. So we need some fat loss experience, and again, we went over those ratios, 4 to 1. So every 8 months spent gaining, 2 months of fat loss, or at the very least 3/4 of the time gaining, and then that other quarter spent on fat loss. And that's how our 3 years should be divvied up. Again, it's not an absolute rule, but there's definitely some flexibility there. But it's some people might be able to do this with a ratio that's a little different. But again, you want some good fat loss experience so that you can develop all those skills, so that you can play with different protocols. And last thing on this topic, often overlooked, is how we rebound after those fat loss skills. Because we've all heard those stories about people post contest prep gaining X amount of weight after they are done with it, and how hard that was. And I think even with general fat loss phases, it's a little rough to transition out. But every time it should get a little bit better, and we should know what to expect, because it's going to be very similar to that when we are done with a contest prep. A lot of the same things are going to happen. It's just the magnitude of those things is going to be far greater. So judge your fat loss experience success not just in regards to how sharp your protocols are, how good your individual systems are, and in your coping skills, but also in how smooth those transitions were back into a gaining phase. Last but not least, again, when it comes to picking a guide, you want someone who you feel comfortable with, and you are going to, again, be able to build that coach-athlete relationship, because they will be getting all up in your business. This is important, that you have someone that you feel genuinely cares about you, genuinely cares about your goals, and that they have a more holistic approach. There will be times during your contest prep where your coach is almost going to be like your best friend. And that's just because when you are in your zone, especially the first few times you're doing this, that is going to be the person who, out of everyone else on this planet, is probably going to understand you the most and is going to be able to really look out for you in a time where, in many ways, we can be quite fragile. So this is the checklist. This is the client intake checklist, the athlete checklist. This is what we want. And yeah, if we fulfill this criteria, we're going to be more likely to not just make it onto the stage, but make it onto the stage looking our best and getting onto that stage as healthy as possible. And again, like those things, it's not one or the other. The healthier you can stay, the better you're going to look up there. And again, having these things set in place, well, it's greatly going to increase your chances of this happening.